Welcome everyone. So in this video, I'm doing a walkthrough of these topics that are relevant for the second exam in my Principles of Microeconomics course. So the topics are taxes and price controls, gains from trades, we're thinking about like trade between individual traders, international trade, externalities, and labor market. And the other chapter that's covered on exam 2, at least my exam, is thinking about consumer and producer surplus. But I actually kind of think of this as integrated into our analysis of taxes, price controls, international trade, and externalities, and actually labor. So I think that's the more interesting way to think about those things. The reason why is when we're thinking about like the earlier portion of the class, we're thinking of economic surplus as surplus to the buyers and surplus to the sellers. Now, as we kind of transition, we formally define consumer surplus and producer surplus. Consumer surplus is the area under the demand curve and then above the market price if we're looking at the supply and demand model. Producer surplus is the area under the market price and then above the supply curve. And what's really interesting about that actually is when we're thinking about how these things influence the market, taxes, price control, international trade, especially like tariffs, think about externalities or price control, like minimum wage or controls on the labor market. What we're really interested in is how people are affected. And to do that, our window in is consumer welfare, producer welfare. Well, it's coming in through consumer and producer surplus. So I actually think of it naturally kind of putting those concepts into all these others. So that's actually how you want to think about the material as you're approaching to the exam anyway. The other thing is, remember for these reviews, my goal is not to reteach everything. My goal is to kind of reinforce and kind of remind us of some of the highlights. As a matter of fact, there's going to be things that I'll place on any given exam, whether it's the second exam or whether it's the second exam questions that then appear on the final exam, that'll come from these chapters, but don't necessarily appear here. So once again, I'm not meaning for this to be completely comprehensive, although I do mean for this to be sort of a good baseline, sort of benchmark for you approaching the exam. You want to be comfortable and competent with the things on these in this review lectures. That's the basic idea. The other thing is, remember, the way that I cover consumer and producer surplus and the way that I cover gains from trade is a little bit different than how it's treated in the Stevenson and Wolfer's text. And for students, I'd say kind of continue to read the text as it kind of reinforces the key concepts. That said, remember, we followed my lectures most closely for those. Actually, I actually like those kind of quite a bit better. In a lot of cases, I've stayed really close with the Stevenson and Wolfer stuff. I've, taught the large section along with Wolfer's before, and so I've had the experience of seeing how his class works. And then usually when I teach in the classroom, mine is strongly influenced by that experience. But ordinarily, I kind of pick and choose and basically take my best approach to teaching things, and then some of the things I've learned from watching him teach, and then kind of make this sort of what I think is the optimal class. That doesn't work so well here because I can't have you jumping around. There's just too much confusion. But I just couldn't resist for gains from trade, and then for consumer and producer surplus. I think I just like the way that I develop it so much better. So that's why that's why that was the lectures that I developed for this part of the course. Anyway, so that issue sort of notwithstanding, this is otherwise kind of following pretty closely with Stevenson and Wolfer's, and that's the idea. So once again, I'll kind of walk through and I'll kind of go over each of the slides and kind of give a little bit of my thoughts on how to think about these concepts. So firstly, one question I want to be able to ask is, how do we think of the tax on sellers as affecting the supply curve? Remember, we distinguish between a statutory burden of a tax, that's who is literally responsible for transmitting the funds to the government, and the economic burden of the tax. For this, we need to know something about the relative steepness of the two curves, right? The more inelastic is the curve, the less it's likely that those individuals or firm is going to be able to avoid the tax, and so they're going to bear a larger economic burden. This question here is asking a question about the statutory burden of the tax. This would be a tax on sellers. The statutory burden would be on sellers. We had modeled this as shifting the supply curve to the left to reflect new higher marginal costs. So you think of like the theory of supply is the theory of marginal cost, and once we've added this tax, it's going to raise the price of each unit. It's going to raise essentially, sometimes I like to think of the tax as like this additional sort of artificial input that the sellers now have to purchase, because they're the ones transmitting the tax onto the government, that they have to purchase as a result of producing whatever is this product. And so they're buying, like, they got a cookie factory or whatever. So they're buying eggs and flour and sugar, and now they're buying tax, right? And tax is adding to their cost. It's raising the cost. It's leftward shifting the supply curve, but it's not a productive input, of course. And so ultimately, it ends up being the portion that's then skimmed off and given to the government, leaving the true cost to produce the goods as the original supply curve. We'll see that graphically, but anyway, I think that's the way to think of the tax, actually. The tax leads to a decline in the quantity sold. We'd expect that. If we have this leftward shift of supply, it's going to cross a stationary demand curve at a higher price, which means there's going to be a lower quantity demanded. The tax increases the price that buyers pay. It decreases the price that sellers receive. Why? Well, remember, what's going to happen is buyers are going to reach into their wallet. They're going to pull out some amount of money, or it's going to come off of their card or whatever is the case. Sellers are going to take the first little bit, and then they're going to transmit that to the government. And then whatever is left is going to cover the cost of producing the units actually transacted upon. And so the price buyers pay is what leaves the buyer's bank account, leaves their wallet, and then the price sellers receive is what the sellers are left with after paying the tax. Both buyers and sellers bear the economic burden of a tax on sellers, and that's because the tax on sellers is just saying who's transmitting the money onto the government, not saying anything about relative elasticity or tax incidence. What about a tax on buyers? Well, here we think of the tax on buyers as a leftward shift to the demand curve. And I like thinking of buyers, just like I like thinking of sellers as paying for this additional non-productive input called tax that raises their marginal cost. I like thinking of buyers as buying tax, right? Buying whatever we call this additional product feature. It's totally useless. Think of like additional packaging or something. So buyers are now paying for their product plus tax. And what's plus tax? Well, it's what the buyers are then transmitting onto the government, not actually consuming. What they're left with is the amount of whatever is the good that they were able to procure. Anyway, so the idea is, well, we'll have a decline in the quantity sold because we got this leftward shift we'll model as a decline, as a decrease in demand, model it like a leftward shift to the demand curve. What buyers are left with after having transmitted the government's money is a smaller amount. And then whatever is the leftward shift of demand, it's going to cross our stationary supply at a lower price. At a lower price, we'll get a lower quantity supplied. So that's why we'll have a smaller quantity sold. I'll show this graphically in a little bit. The tax increases the price buyers pay, decreases the price sellers receive for the same reason as I was discussing before, right? Buyers take some money out of their bank account or out of their wallet. They transmit the money onto the government, and whatever's left goes into the sellers' accounts. Both buyers and sellers bear the economic burden of a tax on buyers, right? Now we care about tax incidence. Regardless of whether the tax is on sellers or buyers, both buyers and sellers bear the economic burden of the tax. Who's going to have a greater loss as a result of the tax? It's going to be whatever side is more elastic or more inelastic. They're going to bear the larger burden. The statutory burden describes the burden of being assigned by the government the responsibility of sending the tax payment. But actually what we care about is the economic burden if we want to think about who's going to be most adversely affected. So this is going to be determined by our tax incidence. And tax incidence is going to, so I didn't put this on here. Tax incidence depends on elasticity. Whichever side, whether it's demand or supply, is more inelastic, is going to have fewer alternatives to just continuing business as usual and then incurring the tax. Whichever side is more elastic is going to be able to avoid it. So the idea is, like, suppose there's a particular type of bottled water that ends up getting the price doubles because of a tax. What are you going to do? Buy a different type of bottled water. You have like regular tap water, right? And so you're able to avoid the tax. But what about that particular seller? Well, that's their company, so they can't really kind of do anything else other than not produce. And so that's like the extreme version where you'd have pretty elastic demand and pretty inelastic supply. The economic burden would fall on sellers. All right, so a subsidy is going to work like a tax in the sense of the fact that whoever's receiving the subsidy isn't necessarily the one that's going to get the largest economic benefit, kind of like the inverse of the economic burden, right? So the subsidy is some payment made by the government. It's like a negative tax to those who are making some specific choice. It doesn't matter who gets the subsidy, who's receiving the subsidy. The benefits are divided between sellers and buyers based on the elasticity of supply and demand. And so the idea is like, well, whichever side is going to have their behavior most strongly benefited by the subsidy is going to receive the economic benefit of the subsidy. All right, price controls. So a price ceiling is the maximum price that sellers can charge. Price floor is the minimum price that sellers can charge. I like thinking about like physical ceilings and physical floors, right? You could be anywhere in the room, but you can't go through the ceiling. You can be anywhere in the room, but you can't go through the floor, right? And so the idea is, your position in the room isn't governed by the price ceiling or the price floor unless you want to go higher than the ceiling or unless you want to go lower than the floor. Now, all of a sudden, what's the highest you can go? Well, the ceiling. What's the lowest you can go? The floor, right? So the idea is this is a maximum price sellers can charge. It's only binding if the equilibrium is above the price ceiling. This is a minimum sellers can charge. It's only binding if the price wants to go below the price floor. So a binding price ceiling is a price ceiling that prevents the market from reaching the equilibrium price, right? So the idea is like the true equilibrium is on the other side of whatever is that price control. So binding price ceiling, well, we've got a higher equilibrium price and you can't reach it. The highest price the sellers can charge is set below the equilibrium price. As a result, the price is going to be lower, but we'll end up getting shortages. The reason why we get a shortage is because at this artificially low price, think of low prices, larger quantity demanded, low prices, smaller quantity supplied. So if the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied, now we've got a shortage by definition. A binding price floor, it would be a price floor that's preventing the market from reaching the equilibrium. So this would be if the equilibrium price is below whatever is the price floor. So the lowest price the sellers can charge is above the equilibrium price. And this ends up causing a problem. So the lowest price the sellers can charge is the price floor. If it's above the equilibrium price, we have a binding price floor. And what ends up happening is the price is going to be higher. At the higher price, there's going to be a smaller quantity demanded. There's going to be a larger quantity supplied. So to lower the quantity sold, and there will be a surplus. We could think of quantity regulations as in addition to price controls and taxes. For a quantity regulation, we're thinking of some minimum or maximum quantity that could be sold. So you could have a mandate, which is a requirement to buy or sell some minimum amount of a good, or you could have a quota, which is going to be a limit on the maximum amount of a good that could possibly be sold. The basic idea is, whereas we had modeled price floors and price ceilings as like horizontal lines, we'd model mandates and quotas as vertical lines. And so it's just thinking about the other variable on our price and quantity graph. Thinking about markets. What do markets do? Markets reallocate stuff. Markets create gains from trade by effectively allocating tasks. Gains from trade refer to the benefits that come from reallocating resources, goods, and services to higher uses. That's sort of the goal of entrepreneurship. So whatever task it is we're thinking about, the idea is we want to be able to get it done at the lowest possible cost. So we could think about the strategies we'd use to make this happen. One thing you could do is try to allocate each task to the lowest cost producer. And if we're allocating each task to the producer with the lowest opportunity cost, if we're following comparative advantage, then we'll reach the sort of ideal optimal situation. Comparative advantage is just the ability to do the task at a lower opportunity cost. For a comparative advantage, you've got to have someone we're comparing to. So we're usually thinking of like two traders in like two possible goods. That's the simplest model. Of course, the idea extends to multiple traders and multiple goods. But the basic idea is to say anything about comparative advantage, you've got to have at least two traders, because we're interested in not just that your opportunity cost for that particular good is lower than your opportunity cost for producing the other good, but also your opportunity cost for producing the particular good is lower than any other trader's opportunity cost for producing that good, right? Comparative advantage. And then whoever has the lowest opportunity cost ought to specialize in whatever good that is. Absolute advantage, we're thinking about this as being the most efficient producer, being able to do a task using the fewest amount of inputs. You could think of this as like a version of the lowest cost producer. Like if you only had one trader, if you only have one person, if it's just you, you might be tempted to say, oh, whatever I have the lowest opportunity cost of, that'd be my comparative advantage. Maybe, but if you only have one trader, what you're actually identifying there is absolute advantage, ability to do that task at the lowest cost. What makes it comparative advantage is when we are comparing your opportunity cost for producing one particular output with some other trader's opportunity cost for producing that other output. You can have an absolute advantage in everything. You could be the most efficient trader, but you can only have a comparative advantage with a two trader model in one thing. Also, you can have a situation where no one has a comparative advantage. And that would happen if everybody's opportunity costs were the same. All right, so here's our 3-step recipe to identify comparative advantage. Determine how long each task takes each person. This measures the cost of producing each good in hours. Convert this to a measure of opportunity cost by calculating how much time of the alternative good you could have produced in that time. And then evaluate who has a comparative advantage at each task by assessing who can produce each good at the lowest opportunity cost. And then assign that task to whoever it is that has the lowest opportunity cost. Markets allow traders to be able to achieve gains from trade. So the idea is through markets, traders are able to specialize according to comparative advantage. And comparative advantage, then leveraging comparative advantage, produces gains from trade in markets, allows people to specialize. And the prescription is, well, you ought to do more of what you're relatively good at, less of whatever are the other stuff. Actually, like markets facilitating gains from trade, this is like the key insight from Adam Smith. It wasn't just that people ought to specialize and specialization was good, but it's the idea that through markets, you could coordinate economic activity, not just within a household, not just within a village or a small region, but across regions, across economic units, across countries. That's sort of the idea is if we have market-determined prices, we've got this coordination mechanism that'll kind of direct everybody's economic activity to be maximizing the total amount of gains available for everyone. It's very much a realization of the fact that markets and gains from trade is not zero sum. It's not one person gains and the other loses, though that can happen. And when it does, we want to investigate why. We want to ask some serious questions about what's causing sort of a zero sum outcome. But markets inherently are not that. Markets inherently are structured so that everyone's going to gain. Gains from trade are going to be realized by all market participants. That's what makes them mutually beneficial gains from trade. Okay, so how do markets organize and coordinate economic activities? Well, it's through price, right? Think of like Adam Smith's invisible hand. The idea that price is a signal. It provides a signal directing economic activity. If we see the price rising, you realize that now you've got kind of relative scarcity. Sellers might want to produce more. Buyers might want to buy less. Can also be an incentive. Well, that's sort of the incentive. That was also sort of wrapped up the incentive aspect. And then it's definitely a bundle of information. It's capturing where market price is coming from. Well, it's the interaction, mutual interaction of lots and lots of buyers and sellers. And it's capturing all that information, telling us something about demand, telling us something about supply, and when they come together. All right, so now thinking about international trade. So one key idea is extending opportunity cost and comparative advantage into the trade world. So we'll think about that. All right, so for import, just in terms of definitions, we mean buying goods or services from foreign sellers, or an import is a good or service bought from a foreign seller. To export are selling goods or services to foreign buyers, and an export would be a good or service sold to a foreign buyer. We also want to identify trade costs. Trade costs are the extra costs incurred as a result of buying or selling internationally rather than domestically. So this would be like shipping and taxes. This would be important to include when applying your opportunity cost principle, because you want to consider, right, the full set of costs and full set of benefits. Remember our first core principle of economics, the idea that, well, it's not just your opportunity cost of producing one particular item and their opportunity cost of producing one particular item, though that might confer comparative advantage on one or the other. We also want to think about, well, how much is it going to cost us to get those items from that trader to whatever is the location where buyers wish to purchase them. So you also have to consider trade costs as well. Why do we trade with individuals in other countries? Well, ultimately what you want to do is you want to produce a good or service for which you have a comparative advantage. You have a relatively low, low opportunity cost relative to the rest of the world. Then you ought to export. This would be the situation where the world price is going to be higher than the domestic price. And then what's going to happen? Domestic firms are going to find buyers abroad who are going to be willing to pay more for those products than their domestic buyers. Good for domestic sellers, bad for domestic buyers. And then you want to trade for, so you produce whatever you have a comparative advantage in, trade for everything else. You'd import. So anything that you'd lack a comparative advantage for, the rest of the world price is below the domestic price. Then what happens is domestic buyers are able to find sellers from abroad that are willing to offer these products at a lower price than what their local firms are. That's good for domestic buyers, bad for domestic firms. Ultimately, though, all things considered, this increases the opportunities for everyone involved. And overall, there's gains for both the importing and exporting country. They also say, well, with free trade, economics suggests that there's winners and losers, but on average, the winners win more than the losers lose. That said, when it really takes seriously the fact that the losses are real and often highly concentrated, whereas the gains are widely dispersed. So that's really important to pay attention to. Comparative advantage driven by things like abundant input, specialization, mass production, whatever is going to ultimately allow a country or collection of countries to leverage a comparative advantage. By the world market, we mean, well, the world supply, this is the total quantity supplied by all sellers around the world. World demand, the total quantity demanded by all buyers around the world. And then the equilibrium, where the world supply equals the world demand. Then we have the world price. That's going to be the price that the good or service is bought in the world market. Now here for our importer is our domestic demand curve, our domestic supply curve. If there is no international trade, the domestic equilibrium is right here. Be with a quantity of 100, a price of 20. Now, if we open our doors to imports, well, the world price lies below the domestic price. So what's going to happen is these domestic buyers are going to say, wait a second, we've got foreign producers that are going to offer a better price. Let's buy from them instead. Of course, at the lower price, there's a larger quantity demanded, right? The quantity demanded went from 100 to 140. And then the quantity supplied, well, that fell. Right? Be at the lower price, we get a lower quantity supplied. So domestic sellers are now only going to sell a quantity of 40. This is bad for domestic sellers, good for domestic buyers. Overall, the gains to buyers swamp the losses to the sellers, or the gains to buyers swamp the losses to sellers. But the losses to sellers are real and highly concentrated with, think of this as like factories shutting down, right here, versus these additional gains are like buyers getting, a couple whatever is their products for dollars cheaper, right? Okay, so this is a shirts market. Anyway, so and then remember, here we have the domestic supply curve, here we have the domestic demand curve. One of the key mistakes that people would tend to make is trying to shift the domestic supply curve when introducing trade. No, right? The supply curve is domestic supply. The domestic demand curve is our demand curve. When we introduce the world price, we just think of that as horizontal at whatever is that price. Right, so no shift. All right, when buyers import goods, the price declines to the world price. The lower price reduces the quantity supplied by domestic sellers, increases the quantity demanded by domestic buyers. We went over that. Imports fill the gap between supply and demand, and then overall economic surplus rises. Yeah, the imports are going to be this gap right here. So between 140 and 40, these 100 units right here are going to be now imports. All right, so think about an export situation. Here, the world price of snowmobiles is above the domestic equilibrium price. When this country opens its doors to international trade, now domestic sellers say, hey, wait a second. We don't need to sell our snowmobiles for $9,000 locally. Don't need to sell those in Wisconsin for $9,000 when we've got buyers in, I don't know, like Northern Hemisphere somewhere like Canada or Europe, wherever, or I suppose in for mountainous regions, or if it's think of tilt of the earth in the southern hemisphere in the right season. Now we've got foreign buyers who are willing to pay $12,000. Why would we sell it locally for $9,000 when there's foreign buyers willing to pay $12,000? So we send these snowmobiles abroad. What ends up happening is that the higher price domestic buyers buy less, buy fewer. At the higher price, domestic sellers increase their output, their quantity supplied, but this gap between what domestic buyers are willing to tolerate and what domestic sellers are willing to produce ends up being exported. Right? The idea is domestic buyers, to be able to purchase any snowmobiles, have to now compete with foreign buyers. That's why the price rises to $12,000. All right. All right, so we export those goods that foreign buyers are willing to pay more for. That raises the price of goods. The higher price raises the quantity supplied by domestic sellers, reduces the quantity demanded by domestic buyers. Went over that. Exports fill the gap between the quantity supplied and quantity demanded. Producer surplus rises, consumer surplus declines. Sellers magnify their gains by selling more. Buyers mitigate their losses by buying less. And overall, economic surplus rises. The other thing to think about is that if you have an export picture, there's an import picture on the other side, right? And if you have an import picture, there's an export picture on the other side. And that's important to keep in mind. International trade increases economic surplus overall, but like I was mentioning, not everyone gains. Import competing businesses typically would oppose international trade because they have to compete with more efficient foreign firms. Exporters and import-dependent businesses often support international trade, right? Because with exports, now you've got buyers abroad that are willing to pay more for those products. And for import-dependent businesses, they're able to get those inputs, largely intermediate goods, at a lower price. Here's a picture of tariff. So here we have a situation where the world price is below the equilibrium price, right? Here's a domestic demand, domestic supply. The world price is $12. This has now got a $4 tariff that's been applied, right? What's happened is the idea is by adding this $4 tariff is a tax on imports. The idea is that that's going to raise the price in the market from $12 to $16. That's going to help out these domestic sellers right here between these two dots, right? These are the domestic sellers that are going to be able to rejoin the market once the price is $4 higher. So that's going to allow producer surplus to rise from just G before the tariff to C and G after the tariff. Now, the other thing is that the buyers who are paying this price right here by buying from domestic sellers, they're not paying the tariff. They're paying $16, and those $16 are going to domestic sellers. These buyers right here, I guess it's not perfectly labeled, but the buyers of imports, they are paying the tariff. They're paying $16, but the first $4 are for the tariff, the tax on imports, and the remaining $12 go to the foreign sellers, right? Excuse me. So now there's two sources of inefficiency, right? Area E is the tariff revenue. That's not inefficiency, right? That's gains to the government. Area F is deadweight loss, right? This is foregone consumption that would have happened at the world price, but doesn't happen at the world price plus the tariff. Area D, that's a loss of efficiency. Excuse me. And what's happened here is, oh God, this is a situation where the sellers are less efficient, right? And so these sellers are now welcomed back into the market by this higher price, but they have higher costs. Remember, the theory of supply is the theory of marginal cost. And so these sellers right here, they are less efficient than than the sellers abroad. And so what's happening is these consumers are voluntarily buying from less efficient firms, and this is wasteful, essentially, is the idea. So area D is a lack of productive efficiency. Okay, so tariffs, red tape, and quotas are all common tools of protection. Each reduces welfare. The latter two do not raise government revenues, right? Red tape, that's just like bureaucracy. Quotas are quantity limits. There's an interesting anecdote about quotas and quantity limits for Toyota. So Toyota was limited to the amount of vehicles that they could bring into the U.S. market. So what did they do? Well, they figured, with whatever is the fixed amount of vehicles we can sell, we might as well sell our best vehicles. And so what ended up happening is they were able to sell, high quality vehicles that raised the regard that U.S. consumers had for the brand, and because they're selling at a higher price, they're able to kind of a little bit of a price premium and so on and so forth. And so there's some interesting strategy that goes in with quotas, but quotas are a quantity limitation. It's not a tax, and so it didn't raise any government revenue. Tariffs in the U.S. and other large economies are low relative to the past and to small economies. So the tariff situation, even more recently in the U.S., where there's been tariffs on steel and different sorts of products, this has still been small by historical comparisons and small by comparison. Wolfers has, so you could Google Wolfers, New York Times, and tariffs, and you'll come up with a couple of articles that he's written about it, kind of looking at the data. It's interesting. All right, so some industries are protected in the U.S., some by tariffs and other sorts of things. The other thing, while I'm sending you away to go Google stuff, one thing that's interesting is you can look at the U.S. trade statistics. What I think is the most fascinating is if you Google U.S. Census exports imports. That's all you have to do. U.S. Census exports imports, like 4 words, right? And it'll take you to the trade data. If you click on the data tab, I don't want to do it here because, you click on the data tab and then you'll be able to look down. You can find the top trading partners. You can find trade by product code. You can find state and metropolitan data. You can find like the key products that are traded in a given state, as well as which countries are involved. It's really fascinating. So it's kind of good to look at. I think probably at least once you should look at some of this actual economic data and kind of see. It's interesting, especially taking an economics class and then kind of like looking around at the actual data and kind of bringing it to life. And so that's something I certainly encourage you to do. All right, next, externalities. So a side effect of an activity affects bystanders whose interests aren't taken into account, right? So with externalities, it's like if a tree falls in the woods and no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound? Right? Externalities are the same, right? If there's some economic activity and there's no bystanders, there's no externality, right? So what I like doing is I like saying, well, let's identify the primary activity. That's whatever it is that's going to generate this transaction, whatever is the primary market activity. And if there's bystanders, now we can have an external effect that befalls the bystanders. That external effect could be positive or it could be negative. Negative externality is external effects that harm bystanders. Positive externality are external effects that benefit bystanders. So I like thinking about like smoking as a good example. So think of like the primary activity as smoking, right? And then if there's bystanders, now there's secondhand smoke, right? There's no secondhand smoke if there's no bystanders, right? If a person's alone in the middle of a field, 20 miles from the nearest town, they're smoking, there's smoke, we might consider it secondhand smoke, but if there's no secondhand, there's no secondhand smoke, right? There's still benefits and costs, right? Maybe the smoker ends up having negative health effects. Those are not externalities. Those very well might be unintended health consequences, right? We call those direct harms. In order to have a negative externality, it's got to be something bad that happens to somebody else, right? It's going to be a bystander. In order for there to be a positive externality, it's got to be something good that happens to somebody else. Price changes are also not an externality. So it increases in price, it hurts consumers, and it's unintended probably, but the harm to customers is offset by gains to sellers. So the price changes aren't externalities because once the effects are totaled, there's not cost nor benefits generated. Negative externalities create external costs. So we have our marginal private cost. That's the marginal cost felt by our individual decision maker. So it's the extra cost from one additional unit that's paid by the seller. The external cost is the cost imposed on bystanders, and the marginal external cost is the additional extra cost that befalls bystanders from one additional unit of the activity. The marginal social cost is going to be all the marginal costs, regardless of who's paying them. So marginal private cost plus marginal social cost, or marginal external cost. Oh, this says, look at this. This says marginal. This is a typo. Actually, in the Wolfer slides, it should be marginal cost equals marginal private cost plus marginal external cost, right? Okay. Got this right here. So positive externalities create external benefits. So the marginal private benefit, the external benefit from one additional unit that affects the buyer. External benefit is a benefit accruing to bystanders. The marginal external benefit is the additional extra benefit that's befalling our bystander. Marginal social benefit is going to collect all the marginal benefits, no matter who's receiving them. So the marginal social benefit is just marginal private benefit plus the marginal external benefit. Okay, this gives rise to our rational rule for society. Remember, we have all kinds of rational rules, which basically just says we want to produce where marginal benefit equals marginal cost, right? The socially optimal outcome is where the marginal social benefit equals the marginal social cost. Produce more of the product as long as its marginal social benefit is at least as large as the marginal social cost. Excuse me. So the outcome that's most efficient for society as a whole, including the interests of buyers, sellers, and bystanders, is our socially optimal outcome. Now, with externalities, that happens at a different point than what the equilibrium is going to be, what the competitive equilibrium would be. And so we have this externality problem. We have a problem of overproduction in the case of negative externalities, and underproduction in the case of positive externalities. The idea with overproduction is we are getting too much of whatever is the bad side effect, so we should do less of the primary activity. The idea with underproduction is we're not getting enough of the good side effect, so we should increase the activity. All right, so to be able to internalize the externality, well, the problem is, firstly, whatever is this additional benefit or additional cost is not salient, and it's difficult to quantify. And so it's really difficult for our decision makers to pay attention. And so very often we come up with some way to proxy for whatever is that externality. It could be through private bargaining. That's sort of like Coe's theorem. So we bring together our transactors and they could kind of sort things out. We could fix the price with taxes and subsidies, and the tax kind of acts as like a proxy for the negative additional external cost, or the subsidy is a proxy for the positive additional benefit. We could try to solve the quantity problem, like cap and trade, and by limiting the amount of carbon emissions. Laws, rules, and regulations are also relevant. In the case of public goods are those goods that are non-rival and non-excludable. So we might try to overcome the free rider problem by having the government produce the private good. And then the last thing, like especially with common resources, you could assign ownership rights, and the idea then is that somebody will look after whatever is the resource. All right, so corrective tax is a tax designed to induce people to take into consideration the negative externalities they cause. So you ideally try to set up a tax on whatever is the primary activity that's equal to the size of the external cost. And the decision maker is not going to be able to pay attention to the externality, but they're sure going to pay attention to the tax, and then they're going to reduce the amount of whatever is that original activity, thereby reducing the negative external effect. So that can solve negative externality problems. And corrective subsidies can fix a positive externality issue by if the corrective subsidy matches exactly the level of the external benefit that then gets our decision maker to produce more. All right. So special problems arise when the product is non-excludable. So non-excludable means you can't limit who has access. This would be like groundwater or like the air or something like that. So people can't be easily excluded from using the good. The problem is, well, if it's the situation where the goods also rival. So one person's use also affects how much remains for other people. So a non-rival good is one where one person's use doesn't diminish how much remains for other people. A rival good is one where it does. When people can't be easily excluded from using something, we can get the free rider problem. So that's the problem where you can get the benefits without bearing the costs, and then we don't have enough interest in providing whatever is that good in the first place. So this would be like watching PBS or NPR without ever making a donation. And the problem is there's less funds available to provide that service in the first place because people free ride. With non-rival goods, free riders enjoy the positive externalities without hurting other people directly. They hurt indirectly by not funding the good. Common resource is a good that's rival and non-excludable. So this would be like a fishery or the town commons or something like that. And so the problem is the tragedy of the commons. This is overconsumption. This happens whenever rival goods are non-excludable. And the issue is a social dilemma where private incentives are towards overconsumption and social incentives are towards conservation. This is a problem. How do you solve it? Well, you can assign ownership rights to solve the tragedy of the commons so that society and individual interests are aligned. All right. Wages and employment are determined by the intersection of downward sloping demand and upward sloping supply, right? So in our labor market, we have our labor demand, we have our labor supply. Remember, labor demand is firms hiring workers. Labor supply is workers willing to work. Why does the demand for labor slope downward? Well, if the wage is too high, employers hire employers hire fewer employees and sell fewer goods. If the wage is low, employers stay open longer hours and sell more goods. So it's essentially just a law of demand story. Why does the labor supply slope upward? Well, if the wage is too low, employees take other jobs. If the wage is high, employees flock to the high wage job. So it's a law of supply in the context of the labor market. How many workers should you hire at what price? Well, in a competitive labor market, the employers pay the market wage. We apply the core principles of Econ to find out exactly how many workers to hire. So calculate the marginal cost and benefit of one more worker. The marginal product of labor is the additional output that occurs when you hire one additional worker. And the marginal revenue product is the marginal revenue from hiring an additional worker. So to get this, you have whatever is the marginal product. That's the additional output that one more worker is going to convey. And then that marginal product is multiplied by the market price, and that gives us the marginal revenue. And the idea is you'll hire up until the point where the marginal revenue product equals the marginal cost of hiring that worker. And that's our rational rule for employers. Hire more workers if the marginal revenue product is greater than or equal to the wage. Right? Marginal cost of hiring another worker is the wage. Labor demand is shifted by the following. So changes in demand for your product. It's a drive demand, right? Labor is a drive demand. Drive meaning the demand isn't for workers. It's for the things the workers are going to make. And then if there's changes in the price of capital, so we have a scale effect and a substitution effect. I like thinking the scale effect is like the complements effect and the substitution effect is the substitutes effect. So the substitution effect means you can replace labor with capital. Scale effect means you need more workers as you increase the size of the operation. Excuse me. Individual labor supply. So how do you allocate your time between labor and leisure? Well, you think of the opportunity cost of working. So things you'd be doing instead of working. Choose how many hours to work by thinking at the margin. Your labor supply depends on the balance of income and substitution effects. So remember, as the wage rises, there's an income effect and a substitution effect. There's a substitution effect where you want to swap more of your time from leisure towards working because you're being paid at a more remunerative level. But then as the wage gets really high, maybe you reach some threshold and now you want to work less. You want to literally buy back. This is like the income effect. You want to buy back some of your free time. Remember, there's the Freakonomics. There's a paper. I forget who the authors of the paper were, but it's mentioned in Freakonomics. Had to do with like taxi drivers in New York City, I think, on rainy days. So on rainy days, people higher demand for taxis. And so you might expect that the taxi drivers would just really make a lot of money on those days. No, what they would do is can't find a taxi on a rainy day because what happens is they have some threshold that they want to hit on a given day. You have to pay for their medallion and for having the car that day, and then there's some amount that they want to bring home, and once they've hit their threshold they just go home. And so the idea is, well, there must be an income effect that's sort of dominating. Excuse me. All right, so rational rule for workers. So work one more hour as long as the wage is at least as large as the marginal benefit as another hour of leisure. Substitution effect measures how people respond to changes in relative prices. It says higher wages make work relatively more attractive. It's not what happens in the rainy day taxi example. And the income effect measures how people respond to changes in income. It says higher income makes leisure more attractive. That's what was going on. There's 4 factors that shift the market labor supply. Changes in wages and other occupations. So this affects your opportunity cost of working at any price in that market. Changes in the number of workers. Changes in the benefits of not working. So video games or whatever. And then changes in non-wage benefits, subsidies, and income taxes. All right, very good. So I'm going to go ahead and conclude here. Stay healthy, everyone, and I'll see you next time.